The most common thing teachers tell me are students aren't trying, or they're not retaining what I taught, or I need help with behavior. Last week, I was in a room with coaches, department chairs, and administrators all training together, and someone said their teachers would be moving really fast through the content this week. And I said, why? And they said, well, the pacing guide, it's the end of the year. And I thought, well, that's a significant problem. There's a difference between being really efficient and moving way too quickly. And when we rush through a lesson, opening especially, thinking we're protecting instructional time, we're actually sacrificing the exact foundations that create the conditions for every student to access the learning. A strong opening doesn't guarantee every student will be ready, but it sure gives every student the best possible chance. Today, I'm going to give you 3 strategies that will help you see those foundations as an observer that we can establish at the outset of learning and help teachers see them too, see that opening time as essential. I want us to think about those first 10 to 15 minutes of a lesson right after we've greeted at the door or done a quick wellness check. And here's what I want you to consider before we get there as an observer. When students are consistently encountering barriers, the task is inaccessible, like lesson after lesson. They just develop these survival skills. They're copying, avoiding, heads down, even compliance without engagement. These are responses. They tell us something important about what has been built or not built for students over time. Now, don't come for me. I know there are always multiple contributors, but when we consider a student who's walked in carrying stress from home or from the hallway, they just have a lower threshold for what feels like a threat. And a perfect opening routine is not going to be a magic pill. We can't always control what students bring in, but we can control what we build and how we respond. Let me just be specific on 2 words you'll hear me use in this video. A barrier, any aspect of the design of a learning experience that keeps a student from being able to access or demonstrate learning. And we know from UDL that barriers live in designs, not students. And a scaffold, a way to address or prevent a barrier. It's temporary, intentional. It supports a student's access something they don't have yet. And it's built for what these students actually need. For example, front-end scaffolding, building those supports into the design of the opening before problems arise is some of the most powerful work we can do. But it's crunch time, and now we're going to skip it because the end of the year is coming. Or maybe most teachers learn to start a lesson by doing a set of things. Post the target, referenced yesterday, introduced today. The steps are logical. When those steps become rote and automatic, when we're just kind of moving through them rather than making decisions with them, we stop actually asking what each move is supposed to do for the learners. And that's where students start to fall through the cracks that we as teachers didn't even know we created. As an observer, I want you to frame this going into every lesson. Is it accessible? Meaning, are students able to learn? What barriers existed and did the teacher anticipate them? What's arising as students are beginning the new learning? And is the teacher seeing it and responding? That shift from watching the teacher go through steps to understanding whether students are being set up for success, that's the real work. Our job as observers is not to look for gotchas. It's to be a partner and to notice what a teacher maybe cannot see from where they're standing or has forgotten to check or maybe is taken for granted after 7 or 8 years of the same routine. Okay, so let's get to these 3 strategies that will help you determine whether students have what they need to begin. The first strategy is to interact to determine prior learning. Now, that could be asking students questions. That could also just be listening to their conversations. The question you're going to carry in as an observer: what has this student been able to tap into from earlier learning, and is it enough to attach new learning to? We know the research on memory and learning is consistent. New information is most likely to stick when it connects to something already held in long-term memory. Without that connection, new content is just isolated. It's harder to retain, harder to transfer, harder to build on. Saying remember yesterday is not activation. You referenced prior learning. Asking students to retrieve and use prior knowledge, like through a partner conversation, a quick rate, a targeted question, that is something completely different. So an observer's question isn't, did the teacher prompt them to remember? It's, what did students actually retrieve and how did they connect it to today? So I'm in 3rd grade math. The learning target is I can tell elapsed time on an analog clock. The teacher says, "Remember, we've been learning how to tell what time it is. Now we want to see how long it takes to do something." And she showed elapsed time on a clock. I went over to students and I started asking, "What does elapsed mean?" First student said it goes by. Close. Second student, "I don't remember." And then I started to hear some others say, "I don't remember." And then I said, "What's an analog clock?" And a student said, "A clock that tells time." This is good evidence in combination with the teacher's words, which she actually said, and what the student is actually holding right now. Before the lesson moves any further forward, what else did they need? Without those core understandings, elapsed and analog, how deep can the learning go? And when you bring that to a teacher, while you stated what they would be learning, did you notice when you floated what was keeping them from moving forward? Because I had a conversation with a few and they didn't have those basic prereq concepts from the previous lesson. I wonder, what can you add to your routine to activate prior learning and really ensure readiness before the new learning begins? The second strategy I want to share for the opening of a lesson is to interact with students to determine their understanding of relevance and context. And the question is, do students understand why today and where this learning is taking them? We know research on motivation and learning is clear. Students who can connect what they're learning to something that matters to them are meaningfully more likely to persist when things get hard. And when students can't tell you what they're learning or why they're learning something, not for the test, not because we have to, you have also found something worth naming. I was in a high school English class and I asked the student, they were reading The Crucible, it was in the fall, and I asked, "Why are you reading The Crucible? What are the good, why?" And he said, "Because it's fall." I was in a fifth grade math class and they were learning fractions. And I asked a student, "When would you ever need to multiply fractions outside of school?" And the student said, "Like if you're an architect." And I had heard the teacher say that. And I said, "Do you want to be an architect?" And the student said, "No, I want to run a hotel." And that conversation went somewhere real. I helped the students see exactly why or when a hotel manager might have to measure precisely and multiply fractions. And suddenly the math had a place to land. It took 2 minutes. And now it's evidence for the teacher that while she included an example, it isn't connecting for some students, and there's just one additional move that she could use. And the third strategy I want to share is about interacting to determine students' understanding of essential vocabulary. And the question you can carry in is, can students access the language the teacher is using to teach them? And what did the teacher build to get them there? This is not about whether teachers define the words or have a single student recall and call out a synonym. It's about whether students have vocab in a form they can actually use. Vocab in the learning target, in the directions, on the paper in front of them. Research on vocab acquisition is consistent. We know they need multiple exposures and varied context with opportunities to make the word their own. And the first question I ask when I read a learning target in my head is, can students read and pronounce this word? Never take that for granted. I was in a high school science learning target was, I can create a website to demonstrate homeostasis. Now, if we're already in a place where we're trying to create a website, this is not the first day they're seeing homeostasis. So I asked the student to read the target aloud, and he got stuck on homeostasis. And I finally said the word for him. I said, "That's homeostasis. And as an ELA teacher, what is that?" He said, "I don't know, but I think I should." The student thinks that he should know it. The entire lesson is built around demonstrating it, and he can't read the word. That is the access floor, and it tells you immediately what the opening moves needed to include and didn't, and then begs larger questions for what we did in previous lessons. The teacher potentially has no idea that students can't pronounce or define that word. And she also didn't create a moment to find out. So as an observer, you're also modeling formative assessment. The moves and supports we put in place by anticipating places that could create inaccessibility, that's a scaffold. By anticipating barriers that will influence how they will connect concepts through the year in broader context, how they'll access academic and essential vocabulary in the first 10 to 15 minutes is essential. A quick demonstration using the vocabulary goes miles. That's the front-end design that changes what students can do when the lesson begins. Ask yourself, who is making the connections in the rooms you visit? The teacher or the students? When students can't answer why, that's not always a motivation gap. That's a design gap. Your observation just made it visible. Here's what changes when we start to think this way. We stop walking in to check the teaching. You start walking in to understand what students are experiencing and whether they have what they need to begin the learning. We want to be valuable thought partners focused on impact. And when you think about the questions I mentioned at the beginning, the teachers are often asking me, how often is a behavior or an inability to retain a lesson related to the opening routines every day? We want to collect evidence about how the opening anticipated barriers. Did the teacher look at that learning target and ask, what would make this inaccessible for some of my students? And then are they responding in the moment? Because these are humans we're teaching as misunderstandings or barriers arise. And when you sit down with that teacher, the conversation is different. Not the target was posted, you reference Wednesday's lesson, but you have specific evidence from learners, or you're just telling them you need to scaffold. Feedback will help a teacher who is frustrated that students aren't getting it, who is trying to stay on pace. Give them permission to slow down and help them see why with examples from individual students connected to the opening language and routines. When teachers can see the specific conditions that contributed to the struggle, not as a judgment, but as information, they can change something. And sometimes it's a small move, a think, pair, share, a pause for students to reflect, an anticipation guide before new content begins. I saw a group of observers energized last week practicing these strategies together, excited to talk to teachers about how they're thinking about the opening minutes and planning them for impact. Watch what happens when a teacher builds a different opening and comes back and says, I had 10 more students ready to begin independently than I've ever had. Or maybe they take it into planning with their department, their PLC, their co-teacher, and they start asking, what will students need before this lesson begins? What can we anticipate? What confusion can we prevent? These are learned skills rooted in how students learn. And you can learn to think that way as an observer. Every teacher deserves a visitor who can help them see how to reach even one more student a day. That's what this kind of observation makes possible. If you want to go deeper in cause and effect thinking as an observer, check out the download below, subscribe, and share this with another observer on your team, and then go practice these strategies together.